Andrew thought he was coming home to save someone. Instead, before the desert gave him a second sunset, he would realize he was the one arriving too late. The black pickup slowed at the bend leading into Bitter Creek, New Mexico, its polished body throwing back the white glare of the afternoon sun. Heat rippled off the hood. Dust rose behind the tires in soft orange clouds. To the left, the jagged red mesas stood like broken teeth against the sky, and at the top of the tallest one, the old rusted iron cross still watched over the valley like a warning nobody obeyed anymore. To the right, old Robert's cornfield was dead. Cracked dirt, dry stalks, a headless scarecrow twisted sideways in the wind. Everything looked exactly the same, and somehow worse. As if the desert had spent 8 long years chewing slowly on the town Andrew had fought so hard to escape. He gripped the steering wheel tighter and kept his eyes forward. 8 years ago, he had left with one backpack, $300, and a rage so hot it made him feel immortal. Bitter Creek had felt like a trap back then. A place where roofs sagged, men drank too much, women worked too hard, and dreams died before they learned how to speak. He had sworn he would never become one more man buried in the dust beside his father, so he ran. Phoenix had not welcomed him kindly. It had scraped him raw. He scrubbed grease off restaurant floors until 2 in the morning, hauled cinder blocks under a sun so brutal it made the New Mexico heat feel almost familiar. Learned English better by listening to the radio in the dark after work, repeating words until his tongue stopped fighting them. Years later, he built something out of that hunger. A remodeling company, high-end homes, clean lines, glass walls, desert luxury for rich people who like their hardship aesthetic but climate-controlled. He wasn't truly rich by city standards, but back here he lived like a man who had won, designer watch, crisp shirt, luxury truck, wallet full of cards that didn't get declined, and now he had returned with a plan, a good one, he thought. Take his mother back to Phoenix, put her in the spare room. Give her hot water, soft bedding, air conditioning, and a kitchen that didn't smell like smoke in old winters. Finally do right by her. It was a beautiful plan. Too bad life had prepared something uglier. His truck rolled to a stop in front of the old adobe house. The silence hit him first. Not city silence, not the hum of distant traffic and hidden air conditioners. This was high desert silence, wide, dry, merciless, the kind that made every small sound feel exposed. A creaking porch board, a fly buzzing near the window, wind dragging grit across hard ground. The house looked smaller than he remembered, smaller and more tired. The adobe walls were split with deep cracks. The roof had been patched with mismatched sheets of corrugated tin that flashed under the sun. The blue paint around the front door had peeled into thin, curling strips. And in the yard, sitting in the orange dust as if he belonged to it, was a little boy, maybe 8 years old. He was pushing a small wooden truck back and forth, completely absorbed, his brow pinched in concentration. His face was smudged with dirt. His t-shirt hung too large on his narrow shoulders. His bare feet were powdered red with dust. Andrew stopped walking. The boy looked up. No smile, no fear. Just a long, steady stare from dark eyes that seemed older than they should have been. Something strange pulled inside Andrew's chest. A tension, a flicker, a feeling without a name. He glanced around the yard, expecting a neighbor, a sister, someone calling out from behind the house. No one, just the boy, the heat, the old house, and the feeling that he had stepped into something already in motion. He climbed the porch steps. The boards groaned under his weight. He knocked 3 times on the heavy timber door. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the latch lifted. The door opened. Mary stood there. His mother had always been small, but now she seemed almost carved down by life. 62 years of hard weather showed in every line on her face, every callus on her hands, every careful movement in her shoulders. A pale headscarf covered her white hair. Her apron was dusted with flour. Her eyes, dark and tired, found his face. And for a split second, before she controlled it, Andrew saw something that did not belong on a mother's face when her son returns home. Fear. Not surprise, not joy. Fear. Then it vanished. "My son," she whispered. Her arms came around him, but the hug was brief, stiff, trembling. Andrew felt the shake in her hands and told himself it was emotion, shock, age, anything but what it looked like. Inside, the house smelled like cedar smoke, goat cheese, and hot earth. The same smell from his childhood. The same smell of surviving one day at a time. The kitchen looked almost unchanged. The old stove. The wooden table. 3 mismatched chairs. Faded photos on the wall. 3 chairs. Andrew's eyes moved. A pair of tiny sandals near the door. A lined notebook on the table. Broken crayons. A wooden truck wheel under the bench. Mary saw him noticing. Too quickly, she snatched the notebook off the table and slid it into a drawer. That was when the boy appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, still holding the truck, watching Andrew with open curiosity. Mary didn't turn all the way toward him when she spoke. "Matthew, go play outside, my child. Stay by the corral." "My child," the phrase landed oddly. Matthew obeyed without complaint, but before he disappeared into the blazing light, he looked once more at Andrew, like he was trying to recognize something, or someone. Andrew sat slowly at the table, the chair wobbling beneath him. "Mother," he said, keeping his tone even, "whose boy is that?" Mary stayed by the stove, hands busy with a rag she didn't need. "He belongs to a young woman from a neighboring ranch," she said too fast. "She couldn't keep him. I help care for him." Andrew watched the back of her shoulders tighten. A lie, he thought, or at least not the whole truth. He should have pressed harder. But something in the room told him not to, so instead he reached for his phone and began showing her pictures. His truck, his apartment, his latest project in Phoenix. A mansion all clean glass and sharp angles glowing gold in the sunset. His crew smiling beneath the company sign. He waited. Waited for pride, approval, warmth. Mary only nodded. Once. That was all. And through the window, outside in the hard white sun, Matthew sat in the dust with his little wooden truck, still playing, still alone. And without understanding why, Andrew couldn't stop looking at him. Because by the end of the next day, one question written in the child's notebook would crack open everything Andrew thought he had come back for. He came back to rescue his mother, but the child in the dust would change everything. That night, Bitter Creek felt smaller than Andrew remembered. Not smaller in size, smaller in mercy. The house held heat long after sunset, trapping the day inside its cracked adobe walls. The kitchen smelled of beans, toasted flour, and the sharp, salty edge of fresh goat cheese. A single lamp cast a weak yellow pool over the table, leaving the corners of the room in shadow. Outside, wind pushed dry sand against the porch steps in soft scraping waves. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once, then the desert swallowed the sound. Andrew sat stiffly at the table, his expensive watch gleaming in the low light like it didn't belong in the room. Mary placed dinner down without ceremony. Beans, handmade tortillas, cheese, nothing fancy, nothing wasted. Matthew climbed into his chair and ate with both hands, focused and silent, the way hungry children do when food is not just a meal but certainty. Andrew watched him between bites. The boy didn't fidget, didn't complain, didn't ask for anything. He simply ate, shoulders slightly hunched, as though he had already learned not to take up too much space. That bothered Andrew more than he could explain. He cleared his throat. "Mother," he said, deciding it was time to take control of the evening, "I didn't come all this way just to visit." Mary didn't look up. "No?" Andrew leaned forward, warming to his own plan now that he could finally say it out loud. He painted the picture carefully. Phoenix, his apartment, the extra room. Real plumbing, air conditioning, grocery stores 5 minutes away, clinics, comfort. Safety. He told her she wouldn't have to rise before dawn anymore to milk goats or haul water or patch leaks with scrap metal and prayer. He told her her hard years were over. He expected resistance. He did not expect one word. No. It landed flat and hard. Andrew blinked. What do you mean, no? Mary tore a tortilla in half with steady fingers. I mean, no. He laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because the force of her refusal didn't make sense to him. Mother, look at this place. He gestured toward the walls, the roof, the tired room around them. The house is falling apart. Then it will fall apart with me inside it. Matthew stopped chewing. The room went tighter. Andrew stared at her. Why would you choose this? Why would anyone choose this? Now Mary looked up. Her face was calm, too calm. Because this is my home. Andrew's frustration rose fast, hot and ugly. He had crossed state lines with a generous offer. He had brought success back in both hands. He had come prepared to fix things. And she was rejecting all of it for what? Dust? Goats? A collapsing house? A child that according to her belonged to some woman from another ranch? You being stubborn, he snapped. You've always been stubborn. Mary said nothing. That silence made him louder. I am trying to give you a better life. The words hit the walls harder than he intended, and then came the sound that stopped everything, a small intake of breath from the hallway. Matthew stood there in the doorway, frozen. His eyes were wide, not crying, just scared enough to go still. Mary moved instantly. The anger vanished from her body as if someone had blown out a candle. She crossed the room, dropped to one knee, and placed both hands gently on the boy's shoulders. It's all right, my little one, she whispered. Her voice changed when she spoke to him. Softer, warmer, full of something so instinctive and protective that Andrew felt it like a jab beneath the ribs. Matthew looked past her at Andrew. For one strange second, Andrew had the sharp, uncomfortable feeling that he was the outsider in his own childhood home. Mary smoothed the boy's hair back from his forehead. Go back to bed. Everything is fine. She led him down the hallway with one hand resting between his shoulder blades. Andrew stayed at the table, staring, thinking, not of what she had said, but of how she had said it, the tenderness, the urgency, the fear. When Mary returned, she did not sit. She stood by the sink, hands braced against the counter, and said quietly, We will talk tomorrow. Andrew wanted to keep fighting, but suddenly the room felt wrong for it. So he nodded once and went to his old room. Sleep never came. The cot was too narrow. The blankets smelled faintly of cedar and sun. The walls held the stale breath of old summers. A rusted nail still stuck out where his school bag used to hang, back when he was a boy with scraped knees and dreams too large for Bitter Creek. He stared at the ceiling and replayed the evening. Mary's fear at the door, the sandals, the crayons, the way she said my child, the way Matthew looked at him, the way Mary refused Phoenix as if leaving were impossible. By dawn, Andrew had stopped pretending the boy was some neighbor's problem. He just didn't know what the truth was yet. The next morning, Mary left before sunrise. The front door clicked softly shut. Andrew heard the faint clatter of milk pails, then the slow fading steps of someone beginning a day before the light had fully arrived. When he walked into the kitchen, Matthew was already at the table with a notebook open in front of him. The room smelled of warm tortillas and coffee boiled too long on the stove. Pale morning light entered through the small window, turning the dust in the air silver. Matthew was drawing. Very seriously. His tongue poked from the corner of his mouth as he pressed a brown crayon hard into the page. Andrew hesitated, then sat across from him. Up close, the boy seemed even smaller than he had yesterday. Sun-browned skin, thin wrists, serious eyes, a faded shirt slipping off one shoulder. He didn't look neglected. He looked raised by scarcity, carefully, lovingly, but still by scarcity. What are you drawing? Andrew asked. A goat. Which one? Cinnamon. Andrew smiled despite himself. That the old one? Matthew nodded. She was here before me. Before me. The phrase stirred something strange. Andrew glanced at the notebook. Can I see? Matthew studied him for a second, then pushed it across the table. Andrew opened to the first page. A drawing of the house, crooked but detailed. Blue door, tin roof, 2 tiny windows. Next page. Goats by the corral. Next. Mary, wearing a giant apron and smiling bigger than Andrew had seen her smile in real life since he arrived. Then Catherine in a blue chair. The desert. A dog he didn't recognize. A cross on the mesa. Page after page, a small life mapped in crayons. And then Andrew noticed what wasn't there. No father, no man, no adult male figure at all. Only old women, animals, sky, and dust. He turned another page, then stopped. This page had no drawing. Only one sentence. Written in large, shaky brown letters pressed so hard they nearly tore through the paper. Why don't I have a father? Andrew forgot to breathe. The kitchen sounds faded. The goats outside vanished. Even the wind seemed to pull back. He stared at the words once, twice, again. Something deep inside him shifted. Not an answer, not even a full suspicion yet, just impact. Matthew tilted his head. You don't like that one? Andrew closed the notebook slowly. No, he said, voice rough. I do. I liked all of them. But his chest had gone tight. He pushed his chair back too quickly and stood. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, the air too warm. He stepped outside into the sharp desert light and stood in the yard with both hands on his hips, staring toward the dry horizon. Heat shimmered above the dirt. Goats bleated from the corral. Wind dragged a tumbleweed along the fence line with a hollow scraping sound. The question from the notebook would not leave him. Why don't I have a father? Andrew swallowed hard, because by the time the next night was over, he would find a hidden box, a photo he never expected to see again, and proof that the life he had built in Phoenix had been standing on top of a truth he abandoned 8 years earlier. That night, the house did not sleep. It only pretended to. The desert cooled fast after sunset, but inside the adobe walls the heat lingered, trapped in the clay like old anger. Andrew lay on the narrow cot in his childhood room, staring into the dark while moonlight leaked through the thin curtain in pale strips. The air smelled of dust, dry wood, and the faint sour trace of old blankets stored too long. Every sound felt magnified, the creak of beams settling, the rustle of wind at the roofline, a goat shifting in the corral. Somewhere down the hall, Mary's floorboards gave one small sigh and then fell quiet again. But Andrew's mind would not quiet. The notebook, the words. Why don't I have a father? He turned onto his side, then onto his back, then sat up. His shirt clung damp to his shoulders. His jaw was tight. That question had lodged itself in him like a thorn, and the harder he tried not to touch it, the deeper it seemed to press. Finally, he swung his legs over the edge of the cot and stood. The hallway was dark except for a ribbon of silver moonlight falling across the packed floor. He moved carefully past Mary's closed door, past the small room where Matthew slept. There, he paused. The boy was curled on his side beneath a thin blanket, one hand still resting on the wooden truck as if even in sleep he was guarding the only thing fully his. His breathing was soft and even. Beside the mat lay the notebook. Andrew stood there longer than he meant to. Then he kept moving. At the end of the hall sat the small storage room where Mary kept old sewing baskets, winter blankets, jars of buttons, and the fragments of a life too poor to throw anything away. The room smelled of cedar, mothballs, and old paper. Andrew crouched near the wooden wardrobe in the corner, the same one that had never locked because in Bitter Creek there had never been much worth stealing. He opened it. Folded quilts, worn shawls, a stack of yellowed linens. Then, tucked underneath, a blue tin cookie box. His pulse quickened. He pulled it out and sat on the floor, the metal cool against his palms. Inside were photographs. The first one showed him as a boy, maybe 5, perched on his father's shoulders in front of the house. His father's hat sat low over laughing eyes. Andrew froze for a moment, hit by how little he remembered of the man beyond a deep voice, rough hands, and the smell of earth after rain. Under that were school pictures, a church program, a faded ribbon, then another photo. His breath caught. A little boy holding a wooden truck. Not Matthew, him. Younger Andrew. Same truck, same shape, same carved wheels, same blunt nose and square cab made by steady hands that knew how to turn scrap wood into love. He swallowed. Then he kept digging. At the bottom of the tin lay a more recent photograph, its edges curled from being handled too often. A young woman in profile, dark hair loose over one shoulder, belly round with pregnancy, eyes lowered. Grace. Andrew stared at her face as if it had risen from a grave. The room seemed to tilt. He had spent years refusing to think her name, refusing the memory of the dry creek bed where they used to sit at 17, talking about futures too fragile to survive real hunger, refusing the way she had looked at him the night before he left, when he had chosen anger and ambition over tenderness, over explanation, over goodbye. Now here she was. Not just remembered, kept, protected, hidden. Beneath the photo was a folded document. His fingers had gone clumsy by the time he opened it. It was not a letter, not a note, not some harmless keepsake that would let him breathe again. It was an intake record from an orphanage in Santa Fe, newborn male infant. 8 years ago, mother, Grace Dalton, father, blank. Andrew stared at the dates, then stared again. His mouth went dry. Grace had been pregnant when he left. Not maybe, not possibly. Pregnant. And 4 months after he disappeared into Arizona chasing some hard, bright idea of himself, she had given birth. Then, given up the baby. The room went silent in a whole new way, not the silence of night. The silence that comes when a truth steps into the center of your life and everything else backs away. Andrew lowered the paper slowly. Matthew, the boy in the dust, the serious eyes, the wooden truck, the question in the notebook. Mary's fear, her refusal to leave. Matthew, his son. Andrew leaned back against the wall and slid down until he was sitting hard on the floor. The tin box opened beside him. For a long time he did not move. Moonlight caught the edge of the paper in his shaking hand. Somewhere outside, wind dragged across the yard. A loose sheet of tin on the roof ticked and settled. He should have felt anger first. At Mary, at Grace, at the years. Instead, what arrived was shame. Heavy, clean, immediate, because the truth was brutal in its simplicity. No one had needed to invent a villain. He had made one of himself. He had left. He had stopped calling. He had built a life so loudly he could no longer hear what he abandoned. And while he polished glass kitchens for rich strangers in Phoenix, his mother had been raising his son in a cracking adobe house at the edge of a dying town. By dawn, Andrew had not slept at all. The sky outside turned from black to blue-gray. The desert began to wake with the thin metallic sounds of mourning goats bleating, a bucket set down, Mary's footsteps in the kitchen, the low cough of a stove catching flame. The smell of warming tortillas drifted into the storage room. Andrew rose stiffly, every muscle in his body tight, and carried the photograph and the document to the kitchen. Mary was standing at the counter flipping tortillas with bare fingers, the morning light outlining the curve of her shoulders. She looked tired, more tired than yesterday, as if some part of her had known this hour was coming long before his truck turned into the yard. Andrew placed the photo and the paper on the table between them. Mary looked down. She did not flinch. She did not pretend. She just stood there in the pale morning light, hands resting on her apron, eyes fixed on the things she had hidden for 8 years. Tell me it's not what I think, Andrew said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. Too low, too controlled, like anger trying to pass as calm. Mary lifted her eyes to his. I can't tell you that, she said. The stove popped softly behind her. Andrew felt his heartbeat in his throat. Mother, it is exactly what you think. The words landed like a blow. Matthew is your son. For a second, Andrew couldn't feel the floor beneath him. The kitchen shrank. The air thickened. He took one step back, then forward again, pacing once like a man who had just discovered the walls around him were not walls, but mirrors. 8 years, he said, turning on her. 8 years, and you said nothing? Not one call? Not one letter? Mary's face did not soften. You didn't call either. That is not the same. Her eyes sharpened. No? What is the difference, Andrew? His mouth opened. Nothing came. Mary stepped closer to the table, her voice steady, but it carried 8 years of buried hurt like a blade kept sharp in cloth. You left without looking back. You left your mother here. You left that girl alone. And now you walk back in wearing city leather and polished pride, asking why no one told you what your silence already answered. Andrew's hands curled into fists. If I had known, Mary cut him off. What would you have done? Her voice rose for the first time. Would you have come back? Would you? Yes, Andrew snapped. But even to him it sounded late. Mary gave one hard shake of her head. No, you would not have. You did not come back for me. You came back when success made you feel generous. The words hit their mark because they were close enough to true to hurt like truth. Andrew lashed out the only way wounded pride knows how. If you had money, he said, you wouldn't have had to live like this. You wouldn't have had to hide him in this place. The second the words left his mouth, the room changed. Mary closed her eyes, only for a moment. When she opened them, they were dry and fierce and older than he had ever seen them. She turned toward the window where Matthew's small shape could already be seen outside near the corral, moving through the gold wash of morning. I didn't hide him from you, she said quietly. Then she faced Andrew again. I hid you from him. The sentence cut deeper than shouting ever could. Because a child deserves better than a father who runs when life gets hard. Andrew said nothing. Could say nothing. The silence between them stretched, alive and brutal. Then Mary sat down slowly at the table, as if the years themselves had weight, and folded her work-rough hands together. When I heard Grace was expecting, she said, her voice lower now, I walked 2 hours in the heat to find her. But she was already gone. Andrew stayed standing, but he no longer looked angry, he looked hit. Months later, I heard about a newborn left in Santa Fe. A girl came through town and mentioned it. I knew in my bones whose child it was. She swallowed. So I went. The kitchen smelled of smoke and corn and morning cold still clinging to her shawl. I took every cent I had, $400. Some cheese I sold along the way. I got to the orphanage and they told me no. Said he was already being processed for adoption. Said I wasn't fit. They looked at my hands, my clothes, my life. Andrew lowered himself slowly into the chair across from her. What did you do? Mary looked at him for a long moment, then said, I came home. Simple words, devastating ones. But then her jaw tightened. And the next day, Catherine said we were going back. Andrew looked up. Mary nodded once. 2 stubborn old women against the state. For the first time since entering the kitchen, something besides accusation moved through her face. Memory, exhaustion, pride. We took your birth certificate, your old identification, a letter. I signed your name where I had to, lied where I had to. Sat in that hallway for 5 hours until someone finally listened. Andrew stared. Mary's eyes glistened now, but no tears fell. I brought him home wrapped in my own shawl because I had no blanket ready. Catherine helped me feed him, and from that day on, he was ours to keep alive. Ours. Not mine, not yours, ours. Outside, a goat bleated. Matthew laughed at something in the yard, a bright sound so small it almost made the room hurt more. Andrew looked toward the window, his son, right there, close enough to hear. And still 8 years away from him. A few minutes later, he was walking to the truck with his keys in one hand and guilt pressing against every rib like it wanted out. He yanked open the door. threw the keys onto the seat, paused. From behind him came Matthew's voice. Small, clear, innocent. Is that man leaving? Andrew shut his eyes. That was the moment. Not the document, not the photo, not even Mary's fury. That question, because in the next few seconds Andrew would either repeat the story that created this wound or finally stop running. Andrew stood beside the open truck door, one hand gripping the frame so hard his knuckles had gone pale. The desert was silent except for the wind. Dry, thin, relentless. It moved across the yard, lifting orange dust around Matthew's bare ankles, rattling the loose wire on the goat corral, and brushing against the cracked walls of the house, as if Bitter Creek itself were waiting to see what kind of man Andrew would be now. Is that man leaving? Matthew had asked it simply. No accusation, no anger, just a child's question, but it hit Andrew harder than anything Mary had said in that kitchen. Because a boy who had spent his life without a father knew exactly what leaving looked like. Andrew looked at the truck seat, where his keys lay beside his sunglasses and the sleek black phone that connected him to contracts, clients, polished kitchens, and a life that suddenly felt as shallow as a puddle after one desert rain. Then he looked back. Matthew stood near the porch, one hand clutching the wooden truck, the other hanging at his side. Mary was just behind him, still and unreadable, her apron moving softly in the wind. She did not plead. She did not speak. She had already spent too many years carrying what other people should have carried themselves. The next choice belonged entirely to him. Andrew reached into the truck. For one terrible second, Matthew's face seemed to prepare itself. Then Andrew turned the engine off. The sound died instantly. He set the keys down on the seat, closed the door, and walked back across the dust. Every step felt heavier than the last. Not because the distance was long, but because for the first time in years he was walking towards something that demanded more than ambition, more than money, more than charm. It demanded presence. When he reached Matthew, Andrew lowered himself into the dust until they were eye level, his jeans pressed into the hot earth. The smell of sand and sun-dried weeds filled his lungs. No, Andrew said. His voice came out rough. I'm not leaving. Matthew didn't smile. Didn't run into his arms. Didn't do anything a movie would have taught Andrew to expect. He just studied him. Long, careful, serious. As if he had already learned that words mean very little until time proves them true. Then the boy gave one small nod and went back to his truck. That hurt too. But in a cleaner way. The rest of the day unfolded strangely, quietly, like a house trying to figure out how to hold a new truth without collapsing under it. Andrew stayed. He fixed nothing grand, solved nothing dramatic. There was no instant forgiveness, no swelling music, no miracle that made the years disappear. He simply remained in the yard while Matthew played, handing him a wheel that had rolled loose from the toy truck and watching the boy snap it back in place with stubborn little fingers. By late afternoon, the sun softened. The hard white glare turned amber. Long shadows stretched from the porch posts across the yard. Mary moved through the routine of the evening with the same steady hands she had used for years. She fed the goats, stirred beans on the stove, swept the kitchen floor. But Andrew noticed now what he had missed before. The slight stiffness when she rose from a chair, the pause before lifting a bucket. The way exhaustion sat quietly in the curve of her shoulders, never dramatic, always present. He had imagined he would return as a rescuer. Instead, he was seeing the wreckage of everything rescue had not reached in time. Near sunset, Catherine arrived without knocking, as if old women in Bitter Creek had long ago decided doors were only suggestions. She came up the path in a faded dress, carrying a bowl covered with a cloth. I brought stew, she announced before her eyes landed on Andrew, then on Mary, then on Matthew, then back on Andrew. The silence stretched for half a second. Well, Catherine said, looks like the desert finally coughed up the rest of the truth. Matthew ran to take the bowl from her as if she had come bearing treasure. Catherine winked at him, then settled herself onto the porch chair with a groan that sounded ancient and undefeated. Dinner that evening felt different. Still quiet, still cautious, but different. The kitchen smelled richer now. Beans, cumin, goat cheese, onions, and the deep savory warmth of Catherine's stew. The lamp cast its usual dim yellow circle, but the room no longer felt like it was bracing for impact. Matthew ate quickly, then slower, listening more than speaking. Catherine watched everyone with the sharp satisfaction of a woman who had waited years for a lie to break open. Finally, she looked at Andrew over the rim of her cup. "So," she said, "are you angry because they kept the truth from you, or because the truth found you before you were ready?" Andrew stiffened. Mary kept her eyes on her plate. Catherine clicked her tongue. "That's what I thought." Andrew set down his spoon. "I had a right to know." Catherine nodded. "You did." He looked relieved for exactly 1 second. Then she added, "And Matthew had a right to have a father. But life doesn't seem to care much about rights when men get scared." The words were blunt enough to sting, but there was no cruelty in them. Only age. Only observation. Andrew did not answer. What could he say? That he had been young, angry, broke, lost? All true, none enough. After dinner, Matthew grew sleepy in his chair. Mary washed dishes. Catherine dried. Andrew sat at the table watching the boy's head dip lower, his grip still wrapped around the wooden truck. Finally, Mary touched Matthew's shoulder and guided him toward bed. At the doorway, the boy stopped and looked back at Andrew, not with fear this time, not even with hope, with curiosity, the kind that makes room for tomorrow. When the house had gone quiet again, Catherine stepped out onto the porch. Andrew followed a minute later. The night air was cooler now, carrying the scent of dust, mesquite, and distant rain that might never actually arrive. Above them, stars came sharp and clean across the black sky, brighter than anything Phoenix ever allowed. Catherine lowered herself into the blue plastic chair and folded her hands in her lap. "You look like your father tonight," she said. Andrew leaned against the porch post. "I barely remember him. Maybe that's part of the problem." He let that sit, then asked, "Did Grace know that my mother took him?" Catherine turned her face toward the yard. For a moment, Andrew thought she wouldn't answer. Then she said, "Grace knew the baby was safe." His chest tightened. "But no," Catherine continued, "she didn't know where he ended up. Mary thought it was kinder that way." "Kinder for who?" Catherine gave him a long look. "Now that," she said, "is the question you should have asked 8 years ago." The words landed hard because they were aimed cleanly. Andrew stared out into the darkness beyond the corral. He could smell dry wood, cooling sand, and the faint smoke of Mary banking the stove inside. "Where is Grace?" he asked. Catherine didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her sweater and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I found her." Andrew's head snapped toward her. "A cousin in Albuquerque helped. I sent word a few weeks ago." Catherine held the paper between 2 fingers but did not hand it over yet. "I wasn't going to let this family go on rotting in silence." Mary appeared in the doorway then, having heard enough to understand. "You had no right," she said quietly. Catherine turned toward her. "I had every right that comes with loving that boy." The 2 women looked at each other across years of secrecy, sacrifice, and shared burden. Mary's face tightened. "I protected him." "And maybe," Catherine said, softer now, "you also protected yourself from the day all this would come due." That one hit Mary. Andrew saw it. Not because she was guilty, because she was tired of carrying a truth too large for one heart. Catherine finally extended the paper toward Andrew. A phone number, an address in Albuquerque. Grace. Just seeing her name in fresh ink made his pulse stumble. "She may not come," Catherine said. "She may not want to see you, and after what happened, she would have earned that choice." Andrew took the paper carefully, as if it might burn him. Inside the house, Mary moved back to the sink without another word. Catherine rose from her chair with effort and shuffled toward the steps. Before leaving, she placed one weathered hand on Andrew's arm. "Listen to me," she said. Her voice dropped low, almost gentle. "You do not earn redemption by feeling bad. You earn it by staying when staying is hard." Then she walked off into the dark. Andrew remained on the porch long after both women had gone inside. He stared at the number in his hand until the ink blurred. Grace was real again now, not memory, not regret, real. And somewhere beyond Bitter Creek, beyond the mesas and the state line and the years he could never get back, there was a woman who had once carried his child alone and vanished with heartbreak in her chest. Inside, Matthew turned in his sleep and murmured something Andrew couldn't make out. Mary coughed once in her room. The desert wind moved over the roof. And for the first time since he had arrived, Andrew understood that coming back was not the end of the story. It was only the first punishment. Because the next step would be harder. He would have to face Grace. And when he did, Andrew would learn that some wounds do not close just because a man finally decides to look at them. Andrew left for Albuquerque before sunrise. The desert was still blue with early cold, the kind that settles into the earth just before the sun burns it away. Mary was already awake, standing by the stove in her faded apron, heating coffee that smelled dark and bitter in the quiet kitchen. The house was silent except for the low crackle of flame and the soft ticking of cooling metal. Neither of them said much. What was there to say? Andrew had spent most of the night awake in the porch chair, Catherine's words circling him like vultures that had finally found what they were waiting for. You do not earn redemption by feeling bad. You earn it by staying when staying is hard. He carried those words with him now like a weight in his chest. Mary handed him a mug. Their fingers brushed. "Will you come back?" she asked. Andrew looked at her, really looked, at the lines in her face, the exhaustion, the iron in her spine. The woman who had crossed miles, lied to the state, and stood in a hallway for hours to save a baby no one else was there to claim. "Yes," he said. This time, it was not a promise made to sound good. It was a vow made because he finally understood what promises cost. By the time the sun rose, he was halfway to Albuquerque. The highway unspooled in long gray ribbons through scrubland and rock, past gas stations, weather-peeled billboards, and stretches of silence so wide they made a man hear his own thoughts too clearly. The truck smelled like leather, dust, and the stale remains of a city life. His sunglasses sat untouched on the dash. The paper with Grace's address lay folded beside the steering wheel. He had imagined many reunions in life. None like this. By mid-morning, he pulled into a modest neighborhood on the edge of the city, a place of narrow streets, chain-link fences, and small stucco homes with potted plants on porches. Nothing fancy, nothing desperate, just people building ordinary lives. He parked at the curb and sat for a moment with both hands gripping the wheel. Then he got out. Grace opened the door before he knocked a second time. For one suspended second, neither of them moved. Time had changed her, but not erased her. She was older now, of course, harder in the face, stronger in the shoulders. Her hair was tied back loosely, and there were tired lines around her mouth that had not been there at 17. But it was still Grace, still the same eyes, the same stillness before emotion, the same quiet force that used to make Andrew feel seen and judged all at once. When she recognized him, her body went rigid. Andrew. His name in her mouth did not sound like memory. It sounded like impact. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Grace stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind her. A small mercy, or a small barrier. "I know," Andrew said finally. "I know about Matthew." Her face changed, but only slightly. Not shock, not confusion. Just a tightening. As if a door inside her had already been braced against this possibility years ago. "Do you?" she said. The words were flat, controlled, dangerous in their restraint. Andrew nodded once. "I found the papers. My mother told me." Grace looked away toward the street, jaw set tight. A dog barked somewhere down the block. Wind stirred a dry leaf across the sidewalk. The whole world seemed offensively normal. "You vanished," she said, not loudly. That made it worse. Andrew swallowed. "I know." "No," she said, turning back to him. "You don't get to say that like it settles anything. You left, Andrew. No goodbye, no letter, no message, nothing. One day you were there, full of plans and fire, and the next day you were gone. Every word landed where it belonged. He took them. Because there was nothing else to do." Grace folded her arms across herself, but it looked less like anger and more like holding herself together. "I found out I was pregnant after you left," she said. "I waited. For a while, I really believed maybe you'd call. Maybe you'd come back. Maybe you'd at least care enough to ask." Andrew closed his eyes for half a second. He had no defense that didn't sound like cowardice, because cowardice was exactly what it had been. "When no one came," Grace continued, "I tried to manage alone." Her voice wavered, then steadied again. "I was 19. Scared. Broke. My aunt took me in for a little while, but she made it clear that a baby was not something she was going to help me keep. I worked until I couldn't. I got bigger, more tired, more ashamed. People talk a lot about life and family and doing the right thing. But when a girl is alone and poor, suddenly everyone becomes very practical." Andrew looked down. The sidewalk blurred for a second. Grace kept going. "I gave birth in Santa Fe. I held him." Her voice dropped there, and for the first time it sounded less angry than wounded. "I held him, Andrew." He felt his throat close. "I thought I could do it. I thought once I saw him, I'd find some strength I didn't have before, but strength doesn't pay rent. It doesn't buy formula. It doesn't make the fear go away when you know one mistake could ruin a child's whole life." She took one slow breath. "So I signed the papers." The words were quiet, but they carried years. "I hated myself for it," she said, "for months, maybe longer. Then I told myself he was somewhere safe, somewhere better, and that maybe love sometimes meant letting someone else give a child the life you couldn't." Andrew looked at her with tears pressing hot behind his eyes. "My mother found him," he said. Grace nodded once. "I know that now." He stared. "You knew?" "A few weeks ago," she said. "That woman Catherine sent word through a cousin, told me the boy had been raised by your mother, told me he was alive, safe, loved." Grace looked away again, blinking fast. "That is the first good thing I have known about that choice in 8 years. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air smelled faintly of hot pavement and someone cooking onions nearby. A sprinkler hissed somewhere behind the houses. Life kept moving, indifferent to the wreckage and 2 people standing on a porch. "I'm sorry," Andrew said. Grace laughed once. Not because it was funny, because the words were too small. "I know," she said, "but sorry is the cheapest part." He nodded. She was right. Again. Then, after a long silence, Andrew asked the one question that had been waiting since he left Bitter Creek. "Will you come with me?" Grace looked at him sharply. "To see him," Andrew said. "Not for me, for Matthew. He deserves to know you." That shook something in her. He saw it. Fear first. Then longing. Then the pain of wanting something that might reopen everything you spent years trying to survive. "What if he hates me?" she whispered. Andrew answered honestly. "He might not understand." Grace lowered her eyes. "That's not the same thing." "No," Andrew said. "It isn't." Another silence. Then Grace asked, "And what are you going to do, Andrew? Go back to Phoenix and send birthday cards? Visit on holidays? Play father when it's convenient?" The question was so clean and sharp it left no room for performance. Andrew took a breath, then another, and said the only true thing he had, "I'm going home." Grace looked at him for a long moment, testing the words for weakness. Finally she nodded once. Not forgiveness, not yet, but movement. They drilled back that afternoon. The road seemed shorter with her in the passenger seat, and heavier because of what waited at the end of it. Grace kept both hands folded in her lap most of the way. Sometimes she looked out at the passing mazes. Sometimes she closed her eyes. Andrew didn't force conversation. He had done enough damage with absence. He was learning silence could also be respect. When Bitter Creek appeared in the late gold of evening, the town looked less like a grave and more like a place holding its breath. Mary was on the porch. Matthew sat in the dust near her feet, pushing the wooden truck. When Andrew's pickup rolled to a stop, the boy looked up first. Then Mary. Then Grace stepped out. Mary covered her mouth with one hand. The wind moved softly through the yard. Goats shifted in the corral. Somewhere down the road, Catherine's screen door slapped once. Grace did not run. Neither did Matthew. This was not that kind of reunion. This was slower. Wheeler. Grace walked forward one careful step at a time, as if approaching the most fragile thing she had ever loved. Matthew stood. His little truck hung from one hand. He looked at Grace with solemn curiosity, then at Andrew, then back again. Grace crouched down in the dust until she was at his height. Her lips trembled. "Hello, Matthew." The boy said nothing. Grace's eyes filled. She did not wipe them. "I'm Grace," she said softly. Then, after one hard breath, "I'm your mother." The yard went completely still. Matthew frowned very slightly, not in anger but in concentration, as if trying to place a word he had always wondered about into the shape of a real person. Then he asked, "Did you know about Cinnamon?" Grace let out a broken laugh through her tears. "No," she said. Matthew held up the truck. "She's very old." Grace nodded, crying now without hiding it. "I can see that." He looked at her a second longer, then took one step closer. That was enough to break every adult in the yard. Mary turned away and covered her face. Andrew stood frozen, feeling his whole life rearrange itself in silence. Grace lifted one trembling hand, and Matthew let her touch his cheek. No swelling speech, no instant repair, just contact. Truth. A beginning. That night, the four of them sat on the porch while the sky turned purple, then indigo, then black. Catherine joined with a jar of stew and zero intention of pretending she had not expected this all along. Matthew fell asleep against Mary's side with the wooden truck in his lap. Grace sat close enough to watch him breathe. Andrew sat across from them and understood, finally, how poor he had truly been. Not when he left Bitter Creek with $300, not when he scrubbed floors in Phoenix, not even when he slept on concrete and worked until his hands split. No. He had been poorest when he thought success could replace presence. Months later, Andrew sold the Phoenix apartment, then the truck, then the pieces of a life that no longer fit. He kept the company but scaled it down, managing fewer jobs and training a foreman to handle what he once would have guarded like a kingdom. He repaired the house in Bitter Creek slowly, not with flashy materials or big city ego, but with care. New roof, reinforced walls, a proper water tank. Solar panels when he could afford them. He built Matthew a bed with his own hands. He stayed. That became the story. Not one grand gesture, 1,000 small ones, breakfasts, repairs, school lessons at the table, goat feed before sunrise. Trips with Grace as she slowly learned how to be near her son without drowning in what she had missed. Evenings on the porch with Mary, whose silence softened not because she forgot, but because she could finally set some of the burden down. Redemption did not arrive like lightning. It came like masonry, brick by brick, day by day. And that is the truth most people learn too late. A man can build towers of glass in a city that barely remembers his name. He can wear polished shoes, drive beautiful machines, and fill his life with things that shine. But if he has abandoned the people who once loved him when he had nothing, then all that success is only decoration around an empty room. Mary understood that before anyone else. Grace paid for it more than anyone else. And Matthew, with his wooden truck and his quiet eyes, became the living question Andrew would spend the rest of his life answering, not with words, with presence. Because in the end, the most beautiful thing a person can build is not wealth, it is trust rebuilt after truth. It is a home that stays standing because the people inside it stop running. And on some evenings when the desert wind moved gently through Bitter Creek and the last light caught the old iron cross above the mesa, Andrew would sit on the porch beside his mother, his son, and the woman he had once left behind and understand that the life he had been chasing was never ahead of him. It had been waiting in the dust the whole time.